Right. So, just in terms of an overview, I always the way I think I always like to define things, and the easiest point of reference is always the Oxford Dictionary. What does it actually say? Having come into diving, I'd never worked in an aesthetic sport before. My background was probably in team sports like hockey, track and field, and not really anything to do with aesthetics. So the concept that the technical aspects and what you look like are equally important was really foreign to me. So this was a useful starting point for me there. Then just to look at the challenges that were associated with some of the performance. I mean, I've called it steady sport, but it's mostly the challenges that I experienced within diving. Very brief look at what core stability is. I think most of us are kind of familiar with most of the concepts around core stability. But then maybe look at enhanced core stability. There'll be many interpretations and definitions of that. This is basically something for us that's worked on the ground in what we're doing, because ultimately you need something that you can sell to the athletes, that you can sell to the coaches, and is not necessarily surrounded by loads of research, because actually when it comes down to it, there's very little research that's out there on elite performers. The main reasons for that is you don't really want to share competitive advantage with the whole world, number one, but it's probably more the fact that you don't have time to do it, which those involved in elite sport will understand. Aesthetics, just concerned with the beauty or appreciation of the beauty. Don't know what that's in there, but anyway, coming from the Greek, relating to perception by the senses. I think it's, as I was alluding to earlier, it really is one thing to learn all the technical elements and things that go on with that and still be consumed by what it actually looks like. And I think for a number, I mean, Usain Bolt, when he's running, he's not bothered what he looks like when he's running. He just needs to get to the finish line and do it as fast as possible. There are technical elements that are involved in that, but certainly he's not going to get judged on, on what he looks like, his leg line, his posture and everything while he was running. So, well, at least I hope not. And then performance. This was really an important step for me, just to figure out the action or process of performing a task or function. We talk about elite performance and all those things in performance sport, and we call it performance sport. And it isn't really this thing which is out there. It is something that you do on a daily basis, but you may just happen to have a talent at doing it, and you're going to do it more than other people. And as they talk about, in terms of developing skill, you need 10,000 hours to do it. Those people that happen to do that then get to a level of performance where that's the process of performing the task or function is done at a really high level, and it's done consistently. So just to go back to movement, because it's always really important just to have a framework around which governs what you're actually going to do with. And starting off with like physical performance at the bottom. Newell, when in kind of studying physical development and maturation in young people, kind of came up with a very simple concept. And I tend to like simple. There's plenty of movement theories out there. This is, for me, the simplest one, so that works. But looking at, obviously, the stating the obvious, that coordination and control is going to be somehow related to physical performance. And what he then related that to was there was this little triangle, and there were three things that interact quite closely in order to produce coordination, control, and ultimately physical performance. The first being the organism, in our case, the athlete, the person. Next thing was the environment. What equipment do you use? What surfaces are you using? What's the ambient temperatures? All of those kind of what are the rules that govern the sport. This is my paraphrase, and obviously the task, how you actually carry out the function, and all these are linked to physical performance. So the implications, just looking at, obviously the performance is dependent on the coordination and control. particularly in the sport of diving, control is a really important concept. It's not just about throwing yourself off the board and twisting and turning, but there's a lot of control that's involved in keeping a certain line coming out at the time that you need to, and obviously entering the water. And probably control is a word that we throw around quite a lot. So for me, it was good just to to realize that performance also has an element of control that's involved in that, and it's definitely amplified in a sport like diving. I think this was also a key point. I think as sports science, sports medicine people, we tend to focus a lot on the athlete and not really think too much about the task and the environment. But it's important that from the athlete perspective, it's the interaction of all of those three that's going to lead to performance. What's also very key then is that if we do things to the athlete, it may have a bearing on how they do their task, both positive and negative. And it's really therefore important that the changes and things that we're going to introduce, how we're going to do those, that we're very careful to measure the outcomes first, and we know exactly what it is we want to achieve in terms of performance before we make those changes. We had a lot of ideas and a lot of different schools of thought when it came to, let's say, managing low back injuries within diving. Ultimately, the ones we went with were the ones that worked. You have to be able to have a reproducible outcome. And even though sometimes, it wasn't, we're still wanting to explore more. Sometimes it's maybe because we haven't yet learned to ask the right questions yet, or we haven't figured out how to measure it. Very simple example, we all know massage works. But there's a lot of literature out there. Literature will say that massage doesn't have any impact on performance. I know very few athletes at elite level that haven't had massage at one point of time or another. So it's either that we're not asking the right questions yet, or we haven't figured out how to measure the impact yet. Ultimately, there's a phenomenon there that we know and that we're trying to take advantage of. This is probably the area where the coaches tend to live in. And literally the task is the skills and the maneuvers that are fundamental to the sport. I started, because I was learning the sport of diving, my first question is, what are the 10 basic movements every diver needs to be able to do? And based on that, when they say to me they need to be able to do these 10 movements, and we kind of did almost like a performance profile of that, just to see, because even the coaches had different ideas about what those movements were. And I said, okay, well, what I see is people jumping, I see them twisting, tumbling, and then some are hitting the water. So break down that into, make it really simple for me and tell me what it is that they need to be able to do that. And that became really important. I'll see in the next. You've talked a little about the environment. So I then needed to come up with a model which was going to, for me, how are we going to get athletes to train consistently at a high level without breaking down? And this was the key. We all know that people can have a one-off performance. The key issue is how to do it again and again and again and again. And while we can't really legislate for that single performance, there's a lot of impact that we can have when it comes to making performances reproducible. So we defined a robust athlete as an athlete who is able to sustain high levels of training and therefore high intensity performance. In technical sports, training is probably, obviously the competition is important, but the training is probably more important because it's the time when you spend hours and hours and hours perfecting things. And it's probably the time which we decided as a sport to focus on rather than the competitions. If we got the training right, the competitions would take care of themselves. So all our input was really around the training and seeing what we can do. Now, in diving, a dive takes 1.6 seconds. So in terms of, that's not particularly taxing, um, even by my standards. But if we're looking at 6 to 7 hour training there, that makes a big difference in terms of what they need to be able to sustain on a day-to-day basis. So going back to the model. I looked at the injury audit and the screening as a way of looking at, someone will be familiar with, as looking at the athlete and saying what it is about that individual that is probably going to affect their performance and their ability to train. The next thing we looked at is those key patterns and skill chains that came in. There are things that they need to do. What do they need to do more of in order to get better? The first one represents the things that we need to almost fix or to identify and to correct or to lessen the effect of in order for them to perform. The second part really talks about what is it they need to do more of. And we'll come to that more in a second. And then the final thing was, even after doing the basics within the sport places a certain amount of demand on you. Now, there's little research out there which, for instance, would tell me what the force, what the impact going through the wrists, elbow, triceps, shoulders on at the point of impact. So we can do a lot of tricep strengthening, but if I have no idea what demand the sport is actually placing at the point of impact on the body, then there's a mismatch between what we're trying to do and what we call strengthening and what the athlete is having to sustain as a result. And when it comes particularly to enhanced core stability, this was a big factor. Right. Yeah, probably the most important element of everything is planning and especially the communication. So, moving on to core stability, just very quickly. So, we're looking at the capacity of the muscles of the torso to assist in the maintenance of good posture, balance, and we're thinking of that especially during movement. Quite simply, usually it refers to the ability of the deeper muscles of the spine to actually support the spine throughout the whole range. That was a key thing for us, again, when we looked in enhanced core stability. A lot of the exercises and things are done in a very narrow range, but within diving, within aesthetic sport, you use a whole range of the entire range and extreme ranges of motion if someone is having to look at it from that point of view. So that was really important. So transversus abdominis, multifidus, the general muscles that we're going to be focusing on when we're talking about core stability, getting those to support the spine throughout the various movements that we require the spine to do. Right, so the challenges that we had in diving, quite a first one, obviously, I'm a physio. We had a lot of low back injuries. 47% of our injuries in 2008, 2009 were low back injuries. So we had a lot of stress responses, a lot of stress fractures, and these were both bilateral, single-sided. And it became something that we really needed to sit down and say, we need to do something about this as obviously a medical team, but also as a coaching team, as a sports science team, because this is a multifactorial problem. It is not just the domain of the physio. And this is the key thing, is that it really took everybody to have a significant effect on the low back injuries that we had. Something I really wasn't prepared for was the rapid changes between extremes of range. So going from a tuck position where you're in real extreme flexion to going to the entry where you go to extreme extension. And that's all happening in the space of a second. That kind of speed and that kind of motion presents a lot of challenges in terms of what are we doing on training on because everything is done really nice and slow. They've got to do it inside a second. This was another issue in terms of being able to get in from one shape into another. You've got to have some degree of flexibility, and the muscles have to be able to adapt fairly quickly. But when you're on entry, the body's got to be as taut and as tight as possible. And again, going from that level of flexibility to that level of stiffness was one of the challenges that we had. So this is probably another, probably more unique to diving, is the fact that a lot of the changes take place without any reference to a base of support. So in other words, you're not in contact with the ground, you're not in contact with anything basically. So you've got to have good spatial awareness. You've got to have the strength to maintain a position without any reference to any except the air. And well, actually the board on leaving, throughout the air, and then on entry the water. Subjective scoring. This was a big problem for us. The the judging will tell you that the scores is done on the takeoff, the flight path of the dive, and the entry. We know that 90% of the, and you didn't hear this from me, by the way, 90% of the diving is actually scored on what the entry looks like. And that makes sense to a layperson like me, but not to people, that are experienced. So they may have a great technical, the start was great, the middle part was great, but maybe they've over-rotated slightly and they've got a bit of a splash on the end. They're going to score lower than someone who's got an awful takeoff, has made a complete hash, but somehow manages to find their hands and have as little splash as possible. This was a problem. Clearly, also, in terms of aesthetics, the Russian and the Chinese divers have a very different training regime, let's say, to our divers and maybe divers that are Western trained. The Russians, for instance, have to do ballet from a very early age as part of their diving training. And what it meant is that what they look like in the air in terms is always beautiful. Whereas in terms of British diving, which went through a phase where we're very technical in terms of what we did, we kind of ticked all the boxes, but the aesthetics was something we really needed to work on as a result. It's an early maturing sport. There are big challenges associated with working with Tom, for instance. His first major international was at the age of 12, versus someone at the other end of the spectrum who's 33. It's a really wide challenge. And if they're on the same board, they're dealing with the same forces and all the same issues, but the way you're going to deal with the two of them are very, very different. We do know, for instance, between the ages of 11 and 14, the major system that's maturing, this is according to Scammon, is the central nervous system. And this is a really key concept for us because it's something that, having traveled to Japan, to the Sports Science Institute there, this is something that they're very big on, is looking at the stages of maturation, what systems are maturation, and matching their training accordingly. But if the central nervous system is the thing that is maturing between the ages of 11 and 14, 15, then it means that that's the age where skill acquisition is at its highest. Things like the ability to when you talk about core stability, because a lot of it is neuro-based as well, it's the time when that's the time to teach them. Quite often we find that when people break down with injury, we go back to the very beginning and start teaching basic patterns. Coaches will find that if they get an athlete that has been training with a certain person for a certain amount of time and they switch over at a later stage, they've got to maybe break down some skill chains and some skill patterns, which should have really been cemented and developed at this early age. So it's a really key area, and kind of managing that and allowing them to acquire all the necessary skills that they do, but also meaning that they're not breaking down. The advantage from diving for 10 meter, we know that force is equal to mass times acceleration. Someone at the age of 12 or 13 is about half the mass of what they will be in 6 years' time. So actually, when they were hitting the water, they were hitting it with less force. And we had to actually push our coaches to actually get the younger divers doing more dives of 10 meter rather than pulling them back, just because of that simple fact. So just differences in training that was there. And the last thing is just the increasing complexity of the dives. The average degree of difficulty over the last 4 years has increased by between 15 and 20%. And that's huge, just given the fact that whereas divers would win in 2008, won the Olympics with maybe 3.5 somersaults and maybe 1.5 twists. The last Olympic Games, there were a lot of four and a half somersaults and a lot of two and a half twists. And now it's even going further where people are now starting to add an extra twist. I haven't quite seen five and a half somersaults yet, but I'm hoping that doesn't come into play. But this is the challenge with any kind of aesthetic sport, is whatever you did 2 years ago is not good enough. You got to put an extra twist. You got to put an extra. You got to do things at a more extreme ranges of motion. So you're always under pressure. And after that, it all has to look great. So I have to keep thinking about this. Right. So enhanced core stability. What are the basics? Always come back to this, that the foundation, the things that we learn and get taught as the basics of core stability are really important. You can't even start to think about all the other things to do with enhanced core stability if the basics aren't in place. And if anything about elite athletes, what I've found is that they tend to be people that do the basics correctly. For them to get to a level where they can get to, it means they're doing the most important things well. And everything outside of that, and I reckon that's at least 90% of that, is between the ages of 13 to 20. You're just focusing on getting the basics right before we even start thinking about augmenting, strengthening, increasing, elevating, or boosting, which are synonyms for enhanced. Before we even think of that, we're battling to get the basics right. We're all familiar with the PD from cycling, his theory of marginal gains. That only applies to someone who's at the top of the game, has got all the basics right. And then you start looking for 1% improvement in the different, can be the constructs and the different in physical preparation, in training, in coaching, in equipment. And all those 1%, you can aggregate those to develop an increased performance. So what we find is this is really important, and particularly I make a distinction between activation of the core and the strength of the core. I think too often the two are quite mixed. That if people can activate their core, they're told that you've got a strong core. That's not necessarily the case, particularly when it comes to the biomechanics and the forces that the sport is placing on the body. We want to make sure that, yes, you can activate, but to actually hold that position, depending on what demands the sport places on you, you need a lot more than just activation to do that. So, enhanced core stability. One of the first things is about the range. We have extreme ranges of motion to deal with. And when we're talking about core, we need to make sure that in the whole range, we've got some kind of stability. This may seem very basic, but trust me, when I look at a lot of the core stability programs that are out there, a lot of them focus on the mid-range, the middle of the range, in a comfortable position. And that's not necessarily going to be the best training. So I think it's the perfect place to start. But when you're thinking about enhanced core stability, you've got to start thinking of exercises and challenging the body at the extremes of the range once you've got good stability within the middle of the range. The next thing we talk about is strength. Strength for me really is the true definition of strength is about the cross-sectional area of the muscle. In these sports, that's not necessarily, we need to bulk up. I think the aesthetics then takes care of that. So when we talk about strength, we're really talking about muscular recruitment, the ability to recruit as much of the muscle that is there to perform the task. And realistically speaking, this is the realm of conditioning. Conditioning makes sure that you maintain a high level of recruitment within the muscle. It's the reason why in aesthetics, or certainly in diving, once they've had a 2-week break and they come back, they've lost so much skill. They've lost what we say strength, and it's literally only been a 2-week break. But we know that they start to lose that strength literally after 48 hours. They start deconditioning because you stop recruiting as much of the muscle as you need to. Whereas it was out and out strength, or we're looking at the muscle bulk, that process would take a bit longer. The other thing about enhanced core stability is the base of support. What are you in contact with at the time that you're doing the core stability? If you're lying on your back on the floor, that's a large base of support. A gym ball also provides, even though it's unstable, it provides a big base of support. The next thing we talk about is strength. The one concept we've gone for lots within strength is the time under strain. Traditional training will have a lot of breaks in it. 3 sets of 10, take a break. We've tended to go maybe 4 minutes of exercise without any break, because that's the thing that encourages muscular recruitment. When the body starts to fatigue, then it starts to recruit more muscle units, and this is a really important thing for us. Obviously, the control is there's a lot of if we try and break down what control actually consists of, we're looking at the neural input. We're looking at isometric strength. We introduced a lot of isometrics within our training program, where they just have to hold positions for at least a minute. They only have to do it for a short period of time during the dive, but the ability to isometrics in a lot of ways was the forgotten part of training. We do a lot of concentric and eccentric strength, but very little by way of isometrics. Now, isometrics are part of everything that we do, and particularly it's related to the next thing, which is the muscle stiffness. So just very quickly, muscle stiffness is the change in force divided by the corresponding change in length when the length change is imposed by an external agent. So quite simply, before the diver hits the water on an entry, bodies at full extension, triceps are locked out. So there's a big contraction that's there. As they hit the water provides another force, which if they don't line up properly and they don't hit the water properly, it'll cause the triceps to buckle, or the elbow to buckle. And the stiffer the muscle is, the more it's able to mitigate those changes. And this is something that's quite important, I think, when it comes to control, and maybe it's now starting to be a focus for us in the last year or so. It's a relatively new concept, and there's a lot of research which is being done, out there at the moment. I'll refer you to that just in the handout, just with the references to that. But basically, the more stiffer muscle, the greater force it takes to cause a length change. That's right. So, oh dear, we have a. Right, so the last two concepts, just looking at the base of support, we looked at traditional course training, which really has a very large base of support, and we started incorporating a lot of these kind of exercises where there is very little in terms of just basically the contact with the floor, but we're having to make sure that we're holding positions. And I think in aesthetic sports, this is a real important thing, is the ability to control and hold positions at extreme ranges of motion. The synergy with other muscle groups. This is when it came to getting rid of our low back injuries. This has probably been the biggest thing for us. Is looking at the role of the hip flexors, the glutes, particularly glute med and especially glute max. A lot of people, in terms of the extension patterns, tend to extend using the lower back, but the largest muscle in the body we know is glute max. And can you substitute part of that movement with a hip extension as opposed to a low back extension? For us, the answer was yes. And it was a lot of retraining and utilizing the other muscle groups, and realizing that can only work when you've got a stable core. And particularly when you're doing it in extremes of range, also really important there. The upper and lower abdominal complex, particularly the lower abdominals, when it comes to getting into shapes, whether it's a pike shape or your tuck shapes. Years ago, when Costability, first came into, we were told to stop doing a lot of the kind of lower ab type exercises. We used to put a strain on the lower abs, and consequently, over the years, we saw a big increase in kind of hernias. And that training has kind of come back into play, and it forms a really strong element of our training regimen as well, and especially the back extensors. We do work a lot, in particularly with those two muscles, just to try and once again we've augmented the core. We then try and work with these muscles as well. So just very quickly, you have to able to measure core. Now measuring literally just looks at activation. So we've got some exercise that we look at activation. We then look at range of motion in the spine, and we have to match the activation and the ability to activate in all those ranges. And finally, the strength aspects, and those like a few examples of kind of the strength things that we do. For instance, a single leg bridge, they've got to be able to hold that in a perfect shape for 2 minutes. This really tells us a lot about the ability to hold those kind of shapes. So just in terms of the conclusions, enhanced core stability, it basically activation in all ranges. That's the first thing. Additional muscle synergies that we've got to look at the other muscle groups around the core and make sure that those are strong and that they work on the basis that there is a strong core unit that's available. Stability, achieving stability with reduced bases of support, stability through rapid changes of movement. And we look at the, in final statement, just the benefits to the athletes is really all those above. They could do with all of those things, but at the end, they become more robust. They're able to train and compete consistently at a high level without breaking down. All right, thank you very much.